the 1920s, a time of jazz, flappers, and illegal fortunes. When the U.S. government banned alcohol, they didn't stop people from drinking. They just created a new kind of millionaire. From ruthless gangsters to cunning businessmen, these bootleggers built criminal empires, shaping the underworld with smuggling routes, secret speakeasies, and stacks of cash. Some ruled with violence, others with strategy, but they all had one thing in common. They made millions when America went dry. Today we dive into the stories of 10 men who turned prohibition into profit, some becoming legends, others vanishing into history. This is the true story of the bootleggers who became millionaires. Al Capone. Al Capone, the most infamous bootlegger of the Prohibition era, built a multi-million-dollar empire through the illegal distribution of alcohol, gambling, and racketeering. Born in 1899 to Italian immigrant parents, Capone grew up in Brooklyn, where he was drawn into gang life at an early age. His criminal career accelerated when he moved to Chicago in the early 1920s, working for Johnny Torrio. When Torrio retired after an assassination attempt, Capone took over his operation, transforming it into one of the most profitable crime syndicates in American history. Capone capitalized on the widespread public demand for alcohol, using an extensive network of speakeasies, breweries, and smuggling routes to flood Chicago with illegal liquor. He employed thousands of people, from brewers to drivers to corrupt police officers, ensuring his dominance over the bootlegging trade. His ability to bribe officials and intimidate rivals allowed him to operate almost unchallenged for years. Despite his criminal activities, Capone became a larger-than-life celebrity, often donating to charities and portraying himself as a businessman providing a service to the people. However, his reign was marked by brutal violence, culminating in the infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, in which 7 rival gang members were gunned down in broad daylight, further cementing his ruthless reputation. Law enforcement struggled to bring Capone down through traditional means, as he had insulated himself from direct involvement in crimes. Ultimately, he was arrested not for bootlegging or murder, but for tax evasion. In 1931, he was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, serving time at Alcatraz before being released due to deteriorating health. Though he lived out his final years in relative obscurity, suffering from syphilis-related complications, Capone remains an enduring symbol of the excesses and violence of the Prohibition era. A man who exploited America's thirst for alcohol to build a criminal empire worth millions. George Remus. George Remus, a lesser-known but equally fascinating figure of Prohibition, was a German-born lawyer who turned into one of the wealthiest bootleggers of the era. Unlike many of his counterparts who relied on brute force, Remus used his deep understanding of the law to exploit legal loopholes. Before entering the world of illegal liquor, he was a successful defense attorney, often representing bootleggers in court. Realizing how easily his clients were making money while he fought their legal battles, he decided to switch sides and enter the bootlegging business himself. In 1919, after the Volstead Act was passed, Remus discovered a legal way to obtain whiskey. He purchased distilleries and pharmacies under the guise of producing medicinal alcohol, which was still allowed under the law. Once he secured the alcohol legally, he arranged for it to be stolen and sold on the black market. His operation, known as the Remus system, generated an estimated $40 million, an astronomical sum for the time. He established a lavish lifestyle in Cincinnati, Ohio, purchasing a grand estate and throwing extravagant parties that rivaled those depicted in The Great Gatsby. His wealth and charisma earned him the nickname King of the Bootleggers. However, Remus's downfall came not from law enforcement, but from a betrayal within his own household. In 1925, he was convicted of violating the Volstead Act and sentenced to prison. During his incarceration, his wife, Imogene, had an affair with a federal agent and attempted to seize his fortune. Upon his release, He discovered that she had filed for divorce and tried to ruin him financially. Enraged, Remus confronted her in a public park and, in a fit of passion, shot her dead. His subsequent trial became a national sensation, with his defense team successfully arguing temporary insanity, leading to an acquittal. Though Remus never regained his former wealth or influence, his story remains one of the most extraordinary of the Prohibition era. A man who leveraged the law to create a fortune, only to lose everything to personal tragedy and betrayal. His unique approach to bootlegging and the dramatic twists of his life set him apart from the violent gangsters of the time, making him one of the most intriguing figures of America's experiment with Prohibition. Arnold Rothstein. Arnold Rothstein, often considered the founding father of organized crime in America, was a brilliant and calculating figure who used his intellect and business acumen to turn the illegal alcohol trade into a lucrative industry during Prohibition. Born in 1882 into a wealthy Jewish family in New York, Rothstein rejected a conventional life and instead immersed himself in the world of gambling and racketeering. His sharp mind and near-mythical ability to manipulate people made him one of the most powerful underworld figures of his time. He is widely believed to have orchestrated the infamous 1919 Black Sox scandal, in which the Chicago White Sox deliberately lost the World Series in exchange for bribes. When Prohibition began in 1920, Rothstein saw an unprecedented financial opportunity. Unlike the violent gangsters who relied on brute force, Rothstein approached bootlegging as a business. He used his wealth to fund large-scale liquor smuggling operations, investing in warehouses, trucks, and distribution networks that supplied alcohol across major cities. He also played a crucial role in financing and organizing smaller criminal enterprises, acting as a banker for the underworld. Rather than engaging in direct confrontations, Rothstein preferred to work behind the scenes, profiting from the illegal trade while maintaining an air of respectability. Rothstein's influence extended far beyond bootlegging. He was a mentor to future crime bosses such as Meyer Lansky, Luciano, and Frank Costello, teaching them the importance of organization, political connections, and financial strategy. He understood that crime needed to be run like a business, emphasizing efficiency and discipline rather than reckless violence. His ability to bribe politicians, law enforcement, and judges allowed him to operate with near impunity. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he was rarely directly implicated in crimes, reinforcing his image as a legitimate businessman. However, Rothstein's downfall came not from bootlegging, but from his love of gambling. In 1928, he participated in a high-stakes poker game that he believed was rigged. After refusing to pay his substantial losses, he was shot in a Manhattan hotel. On his deathbed, he refused to name his killer, adhering to the underworld code of silence. His death marked the end of an era, but his legacy endured through the criminal empires built by his protégés. Rothstein's vision of organized crime as a structured hierarchical enterprise laid the foundation for the Mafia's rise in America, making him one of the most influential figures of the Prohibition era. Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky, known as the mob's accountant, was one of the most financially astute criminals in American history. Unlike the flamboyant and violent gangsters of his time, Lansky was a quiet, calculating mastermind who built a vast fortune through illegal gambling, money laundering, and bootlegging. Born in 1902 in what is now Belarus, he immigrated to the United States as a child and grew up in the tough streets of New York's Lower East Side. It was there that he formed lifelong alliances with figures like Luciano and Bugsy Siegel, partnerships that would shape the future of organized crime. When Prohibition began, Lansky saw an opportunity to make enormous profits through the illegal alcohol trade. Rather than engaging in turf wars or drawing attention through violent tactics, he focused on efficiency and financial management. He played a key role in creating a highly organized bootlegging network, working with both Jewish and Italian crime syndicates to smuggle alcohol from Canada and distribute it across the United States. His intelligence and discretion made him invaluable to the underworld, as he was known for keeping meticulous financial records and avoiding unnecessary attention. Lansky's true genius lay in his ability to manage and launder the vast sums of money generated by organized crime. While others flaunted their wealth and attracted law enforcement scrutiny, Lansky reinvested profits into legitimate businesses, including hotels, real estate, and casinos. He was instrumental in expanding the Mafia's influence into Las Vegas and Cuba, laying the groundwork for what would become a multi-billion-dollar gambling empire. His financial strategies allowed the mob to operate on an unprecedented scale, turning crime into a corporate enterprise. Despite his deep involvement in organized crime, Lansky managed to avoid the fate of many of his contemporaries. He was never convicted of any major crime, largely due to his careful distancing from direct criminal activities. When the U.S. government attempted to prosecute him for tax evasion, he fled to Israel in 1970, seeking refuge under the law of return. However, he was eventually forced to return to the United States, where he spent his final years under constant government surveillance. Unlike many gangsters who lived and died by the gun, Lansky died of natural causes in 1983, reportedly leaving behind a fortune of hundreds of millions, though much of it was never found. His legacy remains as one of the most intelligent and enduring figures of organized crime, proving that power and wealth in the underworld could be achieved through strategy and financial acumen rather than brute force. His influence shaped the modern Mafia, making him one of the most significant bootleggers turned millionaires of the Prohibition era. Luciano. Luciano, born Salvatore Lucania in 1897 in Sicily, was one of the most influential crime bosses in American history. Arriving in New York as a child, he quickly became involved in gang activity, running street scams and working for local criminals. Unlike many of his peers, Luciano had a unique vision for organized crime. He believed in a structured, corporate-style operation rather than the chaotic, violent gang wars that plagued the underworld. When Prohibition began in 1920, he saw an opportunity to build an empire, and he became a key figure in the bootlegging trade, working with both Italian and Jewish crime syndicates. Luciano's bootlegging operations were vast and sophisticated. He partnered with powerful figures like Arnold Rothstein, Meyer Lansky, and Frank Costello to smuggle alcohol from Canada and the Caribbean, distributing it across major U.S. cities. Unlike the old-school Italian gangsters who prioritized loyalty to their ethnic groups, Luciano understood that cooperation between different crime organizations was the key to long-term success. This approach helped him rise through the ranks, and by the late 1920s he was one of the most powerful bootleggers in the country, earning millions of dollars annually. However, Luciano's true genius lay not just in bootlegging, but in restructuring the entire American Mafia. In 1931, after orchestrating the murders of rival bosses Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, he established the Commission, a governing body that regulated organized crime and prevented unnecessary conflicts. This move marked the birth of the modern Mafia, where crime families operated like businesses rather than street gangs. His leadership extended beyond bootlegging into narcotics, extortion, and gambling, solidifying his status as the kingpin of the underworld. Despite his power, Luciano eventually fell to law enforcement. In 1936, New York prosecutor Thomas Dewey charged him with running a massive prostitution ring, leading to a 30 to 50-year prison sentence. However, during World War II, Luciano made a deal with the U.S. government. He used his Mafia connections to assist the military in securing the New York docks from Nazi sabotage. In return, he was released from prison in 1946, though he was deported to Italy, where he spent the rest of his life. Even in exile, Luciano continued to influence organized crime, helping establish the heroin trade between Sicily and the U.S. He died in 1962 of a heart attack, leaving behind a legacy that transformed organized crime into a structured global enterprise. His ability to modernize the Mafia, combined with his ruthless business strategies, made him one of the wealthiest and most powerful bootleggers of the Prohibition era. Enoch Nucky Johnson. Enoch Nucky Johnson, the real-life inspiration behind Boardwalk Empire, was the undisputed king of Atlantic City during Prohibition. Born in 1883 in New Jersey, Johnson rose to prominence not as a violent gangster, but as a shrewd political boss who controlled the city's government and its lucrative vice industries. By the time Prohibition began in 1920, he was the most powerful figure in Atlantic City, using his influence to turn the coastal resort town into a haven for bootlegging, gambling, and corruption. Unlike traditional gangsters who relied on intimidation and violence, Johnson built his empire through political connections. As the county treasurer and de facto ruler of Atlantic City, he controlled law enforcement, ensuring that speakeasies and illegal liquor shipments operated without interference. He partnered with major bootlegging syndicates, including those run by Arnold Rothstein and Lucky Luciano, facilitating the smuggling of vast quantities of alcohol into the city. His ability to keep local officials and law enforcement under his control allowed Atlantic City to remain an open town where alcohol flowed freely, even as other cities struggled with raids and crackdowns. Johnson's wealth was immense. He imposed taxes on bootleggers, took cuts from gambling establishments, and collected bribes from anyone who wanted to do business in his city. He lived lavishly, residing in a luxurious suite at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, where he threw extravagant parties attended by politicians, celebrities, and criminals alike. His annual Atlantic City Conference in 1929 brought together the biggest crime figures of the era, solidifying his role as a key power broker in the underworld. Despite his incredible influence, Johnson's downfall came after Prohibition ended. Without the enormous profits from illegal alcohol, his ability to maintain power diminished. In 1941, he was convicted of tax evasion, following the same fate as Al Capone. He served 4 years in prison, and upon his release, he faded into obscurity. Unlike many of his counterparts who met violent ends, Johnson lived a relatively quiet life after his fall from power, passing away in 1968. Though he is less well known than figures like Capone or Luciano, Johnson's control over Atlantic City during Prohibition made him one of the wealthiest and most influential bootleggers of his time. His ability to blend politics with organized crime allowed him to operate with near total impunity for decades, turning his city into the ultimate playground for illicit activity. His legacy remains as one of the most fascinating figures of the Prohibition era, a man who ruled not with a gun but with political power and strategic alliances. Johnny Torrio. Johnny Torrio, often referred to as the father of organized crime, was one of the most influential figures in the Prohibition-era underworld. Born in Italy in 1882, Torrio immigrated to the United States as a child and quickly became involved in criminal activities in New York City. He worked under notorious gangsters like Paul Kelly before relocating to Chicago, where he played a key role in shaping the city's underworld. Unlike the reckless and violent gangsters of his time, Torrio was a strategic thinker who believed in running crime like a business. His leadership, intelligence, and ability to avoid unnecessary conflicts set him apart from his rivals. Torrio's rise to power in Chicago came through his association with Big Jim Colosimo, a powerful crime boss who controlled gambling, prostitution, and political corruption. However, when Prohibition began in 1920, Torrio saw a golden opportunity that Colosimo refused to embrace. Eager to capitalize on the massive demand for alcohol, Torrio arranged for Colosimo's assassination, clearing the way for his own leadership. With Colosimo out of the way, Torrio expanded his empire, turning Chicago into one of the most profitable bootlegging hubs in the country. He built relationships with Canadian suppliers, smuggled liquor through hidden distribution networks, and established speakeasies across the city, making millions in the process. Torrio's most significant contribution to organized crime was his mentorship of Al Capone. Recognizing Capone's potential, Torrio brought him to Chicago and groomed him for leadership. Under Torrio's guidance, Capone learned the business of bootlegging, racketeering, and political bribery. However, as the Chicago bootlegging wars escalated, Torrio became a target. In 1925, he was ambushed by rival gangsters and shot multiple times outside his home. Miraculously, he survived, but the attack convinced him to retire from crime. He handed over full control of his empire to Capone and left Chicago, effectively removing himself from the violent world he had helped create. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Torrio lived a long life after stepping away from the underworld. He remained an advisor to various crime families but avoided direct involvement in illegal activities. He died of a heart attack in 1957, having successfully escaped the bloody fate that befell so many other bootleggers. His influence, however, endured. His structured, business-like approach to crime became the foundation for the modern mafia. Without Torrio, organized crime in America might never have evolved into the sophisticated empire it became. Big Bill Dwyer. Big Bill Dwyer, one of the most successful and wealthiest bootleggers of the Prohibition era, ran a massive liquor smuggling operation that made him a multimillionaire. Unlike many of the violent gangsters of his time, Dwyer was a smooth-talking businessman who used bribes rather than bullets to dominate the illegal alcohol trade. Born in 1883 in New York City, Dwyer started as a dock worker before realizing the immense profit potential in bootlegging. He used his knowledge of shipping routes and his connections at the docks to build one of the most efficient liquor smuggling networks in the country. Dwyer's operation was massive. He imported liquor from Canada, the Caribbean, and even Europe, using a fleet of ships to transport alcohol into the United States. To ensure smooth operations, he bribed law enforcement officials, politicians, and Coast Guard officers, earning him the nickname, the King of the Rum Runners. His ability to pay off the right people allowed him to operate with near-total impunity, avoiding the violent street battles that plagued many other bootleggers. His empire stretched from New York to the Midwest, and at the height of Prohibition, he was earning an estimated $15 million per year, a staggering sum for the time. Unlike many gangsters who flaunted their wealth recklessly, Dwyer invested in legitimate businesses, including horse racing and professional sports. He became the owner of the New York Americans, one of the city's early hockey teams, and tried to expand his influence beyond the criminal world. However, his empire began to crumble in the late 1920s when federal authorities intensified their crackdown on bootlegging. In 1927, Dwyer was finally convicted of conspiracy to violate Prohibition laws and sentenced to federal prison. Though he served only 2 years, his time behind bars weakened his grip on the industry, and by the time he was released, rival gangs had taken over much of his territory. After Prohibition ended, Dwyer struggled to rebuild his wealth. His attempts to establish a legitimate career in sports and horse racing were largely unsuccessful, and he faded from the public eye. He spent his final years living quietly, far removed from the days when he was one of the richest bootleggers in America. He died in 1946, leaving behind a legacy of corruption, vast wealth, and a criminal empire built on smuggling alcohol. Unlike the bloodthirsty gangsters of his time, Dwyer proved that sometimes money, influence, and strategic alliances were more powerful than brute force in the underworld. Roy Olmsted. Roy Olmsted was one of the few bootleggers of the Prohibition era who operated more like a businessman than a gangster. Unlike his contemporaries who used violence and corruption to maintain control, Olmsted built his empire on efficiency, organization, and charm. Born in 1886, he started his career as a respected police officer in Seattle. However, after witnessing the immense profits that could be made from smuggling liquor, he decided to cross over to the other side of the law. Rather than engaging in petty crime, Olmsted applied his knowledge of law enforcement and logistics to establish one of the most successful and well-run bootlegging operations on the West Coast. Olmsted's approach to bootlegging was unique. Unlike the brutal mobsters of Chicago and New York, he believed that violence attracted unwanted attention. Instead, he relied on careful planning, strategic bribes, and well-placed political connections to keep his operation running smoothly. His network imported high-quality Canadian whiskey and distributed it across Seattle and beyond, earning him the title, the Good Bootlegger. He ran his business with professionalism, treating his employees well and avoiding unnecessary conflict. His ability to operate without bloodshed made him stand out among the era's bootleggers, as many of his rivals were engaged in brutal gang wars. Olmsted's success, however, made him a target for federal authorities. In 1924, after an extensive investigation that included the first-ever use of wiretapping in a federal case, he was arrested and convicted of violating the Volstead Act. Sentenced to 4 years in prison, his case became a landmark in American legal history, as his lawyers argued that wiretapping without a warrant violated constitutional rights. Though he lost his appeal at the time, his case later influenced future rulings on privacy and government surveillance. After serving his sentence, Olmsted abandoned the criminal world entirely. He spent the rest of his life as a law-abiding citizen, even becoming a Christian Science lecturer and advocating for prison reform. He was granted a full pardon by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1935, a rare gesture of recognition for a man who had once been one of the most successful bootleggers in the country. His story remains one of the most remarkable of the Prohibition era, proof that not all bootleggers needed guns and violence to build a fortune. Joseph P. Kennedy. Senior Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., the patriarch of the Kennedy family, is one of the most controversial figures linked to bootlegging during Prohibition. While there is no definitive proof that he was directly involved in smuggling illegal liquor, persistent rumors and circumstantial evidence suggest that he used his business acumen and political connections to profit from the alcohol trade before Prohibition ended. Born in 1888 in Boston, Kennedy was a shrewd businessman who made fortunes in banking, real estate, and the stock market. His ability to capitalize on emerging industries and to operate in legal gray areas helped him amass incredible wealth by the time Prohibition was in full swing. Kennedy's alleged involvement in bootlegging likely came through his relationships with international liquor suppliers and organized crime figures. It is believed that he secured exclusive importation deals with major British liquor brands, stockpiling vast quantities of alcohol in Canada and the Caribbean before Prohibition was repealed. His timing was impeccable. By the time alcohol became legal again in 1933, he was in prime position to legally distribute massive amounts of liquor, making millions almost overnight. Some sources claim he worked with figures like Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky to arrange shipments, though these claims remain speculative. What is indisputable is that Kennedy's fortune skyrocketed during and after Prohibition. While others were still recovering from the effects of the Great Depression, he had positioned himself as one of America's wealthiest men. His success in business allowed him to transition into politics, eventually serving as the U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom and laying the foundation for the Kennedy family's political dynasty. His son John F. Kennedy would go on to become the 35th President of the United States, further cementing the family's legacy. Despite the persistent rumors, Kennedy always denied any involvement in bootlegging. Whether he was directly smuggling liquor or simply using his financial expertise to profit from the transition back to legal alcohol, one thing is clear. His business strategies during Prohibition played a crucial role in building the Kennedy family's immense wealth. His story is unique among Prohibition-era millionaires because, unlike the gangsters who met violent ends or were imprisoned, Kennedy transitioned from the shadows of illicit profits into the highest levels of American society, proving that sometimes the smartest criminals are the ones who never get caught.